Okay, so I hope you all enjoyed the ceremony yesterday. It was great to see that I think all of you could make it. So, however, we're back to, to classes today, so no celebration this morning. And we'll be talking a little bit about some of the principles by which the brain is responsible for sort of organizing all of the rest of the physiology of the body. And we will start with a poll everywhere based on Friday's class. See if you remember anything. Probably all celebrated too much yesterday, so. And this is where you remember everything is kind of backwards as far as the eye goes. So has anyone not managed to get in yet? Okay, so we have the class response here. Does everyone agree with the class average? That's probably a good consideration. On the plus side, the answer isn't B either. So the answer is obviously it causes hyperpolarization of the photoreceptor cells, because if you remember, the photoreceptor cells are continuously inhibiting the bipolar cells, which means that they're sort of preventing those cells from firing. So when the photoreceptor cells absorb light, that results in a second messenger cascade to cause hyperpolarization of the photoreceptor cell membrane, which then relieves that inhibition. So it's all back, all back to front, basically, in terms of the order, the way in which you'd expect it to work. So what is less back to front is the control of physiological systems. And this is a concept I'm sure you're fully familiar with, and it's homeostasis. So in order to sort of, and basically it's because as organisms, we need to sort of keep everything in balance so that, like we're, able to sort of, like survive and thrive and so on. And to do that, you need to have some kind of way of obviously adapting to the environment and all the stimuli you have, and also adapting to the needs of your actual body. And so the simplest way of doing that is with a negative feedback loop. So you have, like something goes out of whack, and then that sort of sets off alarm bells, and then there's some compensatory action that occurs. And that's obviously, like one of the important principles by which physiological systems are regulated. The problem with it, if we just use negative feedback loops, is that negative feedback can obviously only occur after something has happened, right? Because it's, by its very nature, it's a reaction to something. And so has to occur afterwards, and there's always going to be some level of delay, but after you reach whatever your alert level is, before you can get the change in the variable and induce some kind of response in the effector. And you also have a situation where you can have over correction, where you actually can cause oscillations, where so something's sort of building up and then you overcompensate and it drops down too low, which then activates a different type of negative feedback loop to try and push it back to the middle, and then those two fight each other, and then you end up with these sort of oscillations. But the general outline of negative feedback is shown here. So there's something that you're like you're monitoring, and this is true whether you're sort of looking at a process in a factory or water quality, or if you're a neural system and you want to sort of make sure the blood pressure, for example, stays fine. So you have your controlled variable, and then you need some kind of sensor to examine that variable, like to say, okay, it's in the good range, or it's starting to drift up, or it's starting to drift down. And so we need a comparator, which is basically what are we trying to keep it at? And then if it's not at that set point, then we have an error signal, which will then be transmitted to the effector, which will then, result in this negative feedback in order to sort of try and move it. And on the right, we have like an example of this. So for fluid intake, for example. So we have excessive intake of water. We have the plasma osmolality. We have osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, which are the sensors. We cause a decreased secretion of ADH from the pituitary, which is therefore the effector. We have increased water excretion by the kidneys, which is a second effector. And the result of that, is that we get an increased plasma osmolality, which is like getting us back to where it needs to be. So that's an example of a simple negative feedback loop. But there are lots of physiological examples where it's not as simple as that, because there are additional factors that try to anticipate changes. And that's where and to do anticipation, we need a feed-forward signal as well. And so blood glucose, for example, is an example where we have both negative feedback and feed-forward signaling going on. So obviously, if you eat a candy bar, you get your glucose coming in. And that will lead, obviously, to increased levels of glucose in your blood. And then, so we can have a feedback loop where we're stimulating beta cells and get, insulin secretion, increased glucose utilization, and that will bring the blood glucose back down again. But that's going to be sort of a relatively slow process. And so for that reason, when we're sort of taking in food, we actually start secreting insulin before the blood glucose goes up. The point being that way it kind of can get a head start in trying to sort of control glucose levels. And so you don't have such a high spike as you would otherwise. Yes? It's still through the beta cell. It's just a neural stimulation of them rather than direct response to the blood glucose. And I should also emphasize, this is like an example. It's not like I'm trying to teach you sort of, cover all of the sort of insulin secretion and so on, because I think Dr. Lindblad will cover that later. Yes, exactly. There's certainly some of that occurring. Yes, exactly. So to do that, if you think that you're taking in some of these things and actually aren't, then you can start having a decrease in blood glucose because you're stimulating insulin production without actually anything for it to do. At least I like dogs. So. So the way in which the brain exerts control of the physiological systems is obviously with secretion of hormones, and then neurologically, it's through the autonomic nervous system. And you've had this sort of this kind of image already when we were talking about neuroanatomy. And we'll sort of gradually over the next couple of years, we'll kind of talk more and more about different bits of this. In, of course, lots of other people's classes as well. Like, for example, I know Dr. Lindblad will have a lot to say about the heart and how that's regulated by the autonomic nervous system and the vagus nerve and so on. So but the basic idea of it, as we already talked, is that we have the sympathetic and parasympathetic wings of the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight bit. It's the bit that gets you ready for some kind of, like emergency situation. And the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for sort of like slowing everything down, and is, like often called the rest and digest portion. So they kind of act in opposition to one another. However, the actual, so they're opposed in sort of general like philosophy, if you like, but they're not necessarily directly opposed at the sort of level of individual cells. And that can, like have some sort of impact in terms of certain types of disorders and so on. But in general, if you want to figure out if something is involving the sympathetic nervous system, then you pretty much think about whatever system it is and what would you want that system to do if you're being, like chased by a saber-toothed tiger or something like that. So, like you'd want, for example, your muscles to work really, really well. And you'd want your eyes to open really, really wide and things like that. So all of those things are directly innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. So we have not that you need to remember these ganglia, but from the sympathetic nervous system, we have this superior cervical ganglion, which connects to the eye and actually does cause, widening of the pupil. We have connections to the heart to help it beat faster. We have connections to the lungs to improve sort of airway flow or airflow. Conversely, if we're sort of, and we also sort of restrict the blood flow to the, gut and so on, because obviously if you're running away from something that might eat you, the last thing you're concerned about is, like your last meal. You're trying to make sure it isn't your last meal, basically. So the converse happens when the parasympathetic activation is predominating. So like the most extreme example of this would be sort of, like say you've just had your large meal and you're sort of resting. So now you don't need to sort of worry about blood flow to your muscles and so on. You're not intending on doing anything terribly dramatic, but you really want to digest that nice meal. And so you have lots of blood flow going to the gut. You're, not that this is so critical, but like your eyes are no longer dilated. Your heart rate is slowing. And basically you're just focused on that sort of like, the day-to-day long-term needs of your body. So it's basically short-term needs versus short-term emergencies versus sort of long-term needs. And as we talked about 2 weeks ago, I guess it was now, at the anatomical level, they sort of look very different because the parasympathetic nervous system all emerges from these cranial nerves, which are sort of right above, emerge from the brain right above the spinal cord. Whereas the sympathetic innervation emerges from the spinal cord, like much of the way down. And that anatomical difference between the two is also clinically significant. For example, if you can have a spinal injury. And so if you have a spinal injury sort of down here, then your parasympathetic innervation of those organs is fine, but now you've lost the sympathetic innervation. So you can actually have autonomic problems which arise from spinal injuries, even though you sort of typically think of those as just causing, like say leg paralysis or something like that. They actually will cause problems with physiological function. So that's the sort of general idea of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. And they're often referred to as having, being a kind of physiological motor system. So if you remember about movement from last week, we had a sort of upper and lower motor neurons. And then those lower motor neurons then obviously project to the muscle fiber to cause contraction. And that connection, that connection is sort of shown here. It's a direct connection from the lower motor neurons in the spinal cord to the muscle fiber. And obviously it'll be using acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter. When we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, it's slightly different in terms of its sort of layout. So we still have some kind of, like in quotes, motor neuron that's going to be in the CNS. If it's parasympathetic, obviously it's actually going to be in the brain itself. If it's sympathetic, it's going to be in the spinal cord. And it's going to make this projection, but it won't go all the way to the effector organ. So you don't have a nerve going all the way from your spinal cord to the heart, for example. There are these ganglia, which are an intermediate step. And so the neurotransmitter that connects the autonomic nerves, both parasympathetic and sympathetic, to the ganglia are also acetylcholine. Just like, like a muscle synapse. And then from these intermediate ganglia, there's then another axon projected. And that is the connection to the effector organ. And so for the parasympathetic nervous system, that second synapse is also using acetylcholine. Whereas for the sympathetic nervous system, it's using norepinephrine typically as the main neurotransmitter. And there's one sort of slightly different layout for which is the adrenal medulla, where we're secreting epinephrine, because that does have a direct connection. So, and the way in which that kind of makes sense is that, so we have a direct connection from the sympathetic nerves in the spinal cord to the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal medulla essentially is acting like its own ganglion cell, because, like it is, and then instead of like sending an axon out to its effectors, it just secretes the epinephrine into the bloodstream, and the bloodstream then carries it to the actual real effector. But that's why the adrenal medulla does receive direct innervation, whereas, say, the heart doesn't. There's for the heart, you have this intermediate ganglion. And so this is basically, just a kind of simple diagram of the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal glands themselves have, two components. One which is primarily responsible for release of steroid hormones, and one which is responsible for the secretion of norepinephrine and epinephrine into the bloodstream. And this is sort of more of a kind of general information rather than something at this point that I'm going to be asking questions on. And the same is true here. And so the point of this slide is to give you just a first taste of some of the pharmacology of the autonomic nervous system. So here you'll see we have these receptor subtypes, and they're organized for the parasympathetic nervous system versus the sympathetic nervous system. And here we have alpha and beta receptors. So these are the different types of receptors for epinephrine and norepinephrine. And here we have sort of M1, M2, M3. And those are muscarinic receptors. And those are the receptors for the slow G protein coupled receptors for acetylcholine that are responsible for the action of the parasympathetic nervous system. So at this point, you should be aware of adrenergic receptors and muscarinic receptors for sympathetic nervous system versus parasympathetic nervous system. And in a year's time, I will be wanting you to know which of these receptors is responsible for different things, but we're not there yet. This is all like a part of a sort of journey, rather than we're not trying to get to the end of it today. So the main neurotransmitters that we're going to be concerned about for the autonomic nervous system are going to be acetylcholine, where we have those ganglions. So we have synapses from the spinal cord onto these ganglia, and those synapses use acetylcholine, and they also use the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. So they're not the exact same subtypes, but they're very similar to the ones you'd find at the neuromuscular junction. Then, for the parasympathetic nervous system only, the axons sent out from those ganglia are also going to use acetylcholine, but the synapses they make will be using muscarinic receptors, which are these slow G protein coupled receptors that are signaling via second messengers. And then the other major, most important neurotransmitters for the autonomic nervous system are going to be epinephrine and norepinephrine. And these are both released by the ganglion cells, autonomic ganglion cells of the sympathetic nervous system. And it's easy, like if you think about the sympathetic nervous system as being the fight or flight, and you think about, epinephrine being adrenaline, as it's also known, it's sort of, you can kind of make that association. And epinephrine and norepinephrine signal through these adrenergic receptors. And so the autonomic nervous system is obviously plays an important role in disease, because it's controlling all of the operating procedures of the body. So it's controlling heart rate, it's controlling vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So if something goes wrong with the sympathetic nervous system, you're going to have problems with blood pressure, heart problems, breathing and swallowing. And for example, in Parkinson's disease, the disease in I think it's 60-some% of cases, patients will develop autonomic problems, which in many cases are actually down to neurodegeneration of parts of the autonomic nervous system. The flip side of the fact that the like any kind of problem with the autonomic nervous system is going to cause serious health problems is that obviously the autonomic nervous system is a major target for pharmacological intervention, because this is where we get our beta blockers to control blood pressure, for example. We're using drugs to specifically target portions of the autonomic nervous system. Another sort of classic example of a health disorder that's related to a specific part of the autonomic nervous system is pheochromocytoma. And it's not a particularly common disorder, but it's a tumor of these chromaffin cells within the adrenal medulla. And so you get overgrowth, obviously, of the adrenal medulla of these cells which are secreting norepinephrine and epinephrine and other kinds of catecholamines. As a result of which, these patients are basically getting chronic, well, essentially, if you imagine sort of like being chronically full of adrenaline all the time, like they're not going to be comfortable. They're going to have high blood pressure, sweating, hyperglycemia, and high resting heart rates and so on. So all of that puts tremendous stress on their bodies and can be dangerous. And so it's basically leading to symptoms that are analogous to excessive activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, and now you guys can explain it, what we just went over to each other. Okay, so what kinds of things have people been talking about? Was there a good TV show last night? So, would anyone like to say anything? Something? Yes.
In the division of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic nerves predominantly come from the cranial vertebrae and the lumbar vertebrae, whereas most of your sympathetic innervation will come from the thoracic cavity and the upper lumbar.
Yes, yes, exactly. And in fact, since we're not going to be neurosurgeons or anything like that, it's the simplest way of looking at it is that the majority of the parasympathetic nervous system comes out from the cranial nerves. I mean, there are some significant ones that do come back from the bottom of the spinal cord. Yes, yes, but they're less clinically significant, and they're also less. There's very relatively few afferents, which means that sort of like this is why the spinal cord is sort of largely empty, like lower down the spine and so on. But yes, and the sympathetic nerves are leaving all the way down the thoracic portion. And so, what are the neurotransmitters that are involved in the autonomic nervous system? So acetylcholine and those for today, those are the ones that I want you to sear into your minds. So you'll be waking up screaming their names in the night. So where does acetylcholine work in the autonomic nervous system? Yes, and yeah, at the ganglionic synapse. Yes. And norepinephrine and epinephrine work where? Yes, yes. If you all remember that, then I think this first half of the class will have been a success. So yes. Yes. No, not for norepinephrine and epinephrine. I hope not. I hope it doesn't say that. It does say that. It should not say that. It should say adrenergic. So if you can all change that.
And then my question is, what are the three ganglionic synapses for that?
So 1 second. So if everyone can make sure that they highlight this and change it to adrenergic. This exact one. This one, yes. Sorry. Yes. Now the second half of your question.
And what are the pre-ganglionic synapses?
So the preganglionic synapses are always going to be nicotinic acetylcholine. So that's this bit. Yes, and you had a question. So for the synapses onto the autonomic ganglia, whether or not they're parasympathetic or sympathetic, are always going to be nicotinic. Yes, yes, exactly. So basically, for sympathetic, it goes nicotinic, then then adrenergic. For parasympathetic, it goes nicotinic, then muscarinic. Does that make sense? I can. Parasympathetic. So we go. Does that make it clearer? Okay. Okay, so now, yes. Yes, M1, M2, M3, yes, yes, yeah. But I won't, yes, I won't, we will in the future talk about the subtypes, but we're not today. Okay, so we've established that there's this sort of like neural circuitry that is involved in sort of sending signals to like many of the organs throughout the body. How does the brain go about regulating this? So we have our hypothalamus, which is part of the brain just above the brainstem. And that's the major integrator for autonomic functions. And it itself then receives some regulatory inputs from the limbic system, which includes things like emotional inputs. We then have, in the lower brainstem, we have the medulla. And that is where we have a lot of the control centers for specific autonomic functions. So there are, within the medulla, so the hypothalamus is the overall sort of like big boss of the autonomic nervous system. But the medulla has the particular sort of like control modules, if you like, for all of the individual systems. So that's where you'd find like a respiratory center or a cardiac center. There are centers within it which are responsible for certain types of autonomic reflexes. So we talked last week about, like the simple like knee jerk reflex. There are similar reflexes involved in control of or regulation of physiological systems. So this is just to give you something to sort of visualize the location of the hypothalamus. So here is our brainstem obviously coming up, and then the hypothalamus is just up here. And yeah, in the sort of medulla is where we're going to have our major reflex centers for different autonomic functions. And there are some additional reflex centers that are actually, descending down the spinal cord. So we talked about the sort of feedback loops right at the beginning of today's class. So the point of this is to sort of say that we have control of some of these things. Some of these things are regulated through hormone secretion, and some of them are controlled directly through neural inputs. And so physiologically, we're concerned about this balance between the endocrine control and the neurological control of these different systems. And so we can, in many cases, like the adrenal medulla is a sort of good example of an intermediate step between sort of neural regulation versus hormonal regulation, because obviously it's a sort of major secretor of hormones that actually then secretes rapidly and they circulate rapidly. But so we have direct neural control of the secretion of the hormones. Similarly, many other hormones are directly released by the pituitary, which is, like itself is directly is the release of hormones from the pituitary is typically triggered by other pro-releasing hormones. So we have hormones releasing other hormones, we have neural signals causing release of hormones, and then we have direct neural input onto some of these physiological systems in addition. So if, for example, if we talk about the heart again for just a second. So we have the heart receives direct innervation from the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. So if we activate the parasympathetic nerves onto the heart, what do you think it would happen? Yes, exactly. So slow down. I mean, I don't think you could. There's enough receptors to actually stop it, but it definitely slows the heart rate down. And if you conversely, if you activate the sympathetic nerves onto the heart, it causes an increase in the heart rate. However, the heart also responds to circulating hormones. So if you have epinephrine circulating, like elevated levels of epinephrine in your blood, the heart rate will also go up, even without that sympathetic input. So that's sort of an example where we're integrating some of these hormonal regulation systems with the neural systems. And so now this is looking back at one of the first examples I showed was regulation of the osmolality of the blood. And that is also an example of where we can have neural and hormonal regulation. So we have an increase in blood osmolality. That will then stimulate receptors in the hypothalamus, which then will activate the thirst center within the hypothalamus. So that is, we're now engaging in sort of signaling at the, like mid-level, kind of the brain. We're, triggering a desire to go out and drink. And so that creates this desire. And actually, we'll talk a little bit about some of these motivational processes in the brain when we're talking about addiction. So we have increased thirst. That will hopefully lead to someone finding some water rather than just being more and more uncomfortable. And we have an increase in water intake, which will then obviously decrease the blood osmolality. However, the thirst isn't the only mechanism we're using to regulate our blood osmolality, because like you can't guarantee that there's going to be, maybe if you're a fish, you could regulate it that way. But like for any animal that's not permanently in water is going to need some way of regulating this in the meantime before they can get a drink. And so in this case, these osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus lead to an increase in circulating vasopressin that will increase the permeability of the collecting duct, which helps in the kidney, and you'll learn more about the kidney from Dr. Phipps. and so that increases water reabsorption. And so that is basically helping the body conserve its water, which help to the same end, as increasing water intake. And so we have both a hormonal system and a neural system acting in parallel. And the details of this are not things that for today's class you need to worry about, though I'm sure you do need to worry about it for Dr. Phibbs' class, I think, at the end of this semester. So another example is going to be the respiratory centers. So obviously we breathe, unless we're like zombies or whatever. And that's controlled by the respiratory centers of the upper brainstem. And so there are multiple aspects to this. And so, like much of it, in fact, it involves sort of little neural networks that are responsible for the sort of like the rhythmicity of breathing. We don't, like, each individual breath doesn't have to be triggered. It's like on a sort of kind of self-sustaining loop. However, breathing is, I'm not sure what class you covered this in. I possibly clinical chemistry, I'm not sure, but you're obviously, hopefully aware that breathing is a major way of regulating the pH of the body. And so the respiratory centers contain chemoreceptors that are detecting the pH levels in the blood. And so there's a signal that goes to these respiratory centers to adjust the breathing rate according to what the pH of the blood is. And obviously, so you can increase or decrease the rate of removal of carbon dioxide from the body. And so this blood carbon dioxide is the main regulator for respiratory rate. And so there's these central detectors of blood pH, and then there's also some peripheral chemoreceptors, just so you don't think it's just occurring within the brain. And this cartoon on the left gives a sort of kind of more detailed view of the control of this sort of respiratory rhythm and respiratory rate, but it's a little more detailed than we need sort of right now. And this is just kind of explaining how we're able to look at blood pH within the brain. And this is because if the CO2 in the blood rises, we get increased CO2 in the cerebrospinal fluid. And in the CSF, it alters the, causes acidification because through the equilibration of carbonic acid. The reason sensing in the CSF is significant is that it has a much lower buffer capacity than the blood does, which means that something that would cause a tiny change in blood pH causes a more noticeable change in the pH of the CSF, which is, like the reason why it's beneficial to have your primary chemoreceptors in the brain rather than like in some of the other ones, like found along in the periphery. So we have this these central chemoreceptors. They're in the CSF where they have a better ability to detect subtle changes in blood pH, and so they're able to respond to that by driving, for example, an increase in respiration in order to increase exhalation of the carbon dioxide. If we hyperventilate, the amount of CO2 in the blood obviously will drop, which means that the pH will then rise, and we'll get a decrease in obviously the urge to breathe more rapidly. I don't want you to go away thinking that that's the only autonomic center that's significant. There are many others, like cardiac controlling, say, the heart rate, your blood pressure, things like that. The majority of these are going to be found in the medulla. And from there, we have sort of these projections that come out as sympathetic fibers. And so, like, for example, if we activate those, that will cause vasoconstriction, leading to an increase in blood pressure. There's a clinically significant phenomenon that occurs if during sort of certain types of brain damage, where you have depression of these vasomotor centers. And when that happens, you have just sudden loss of all of this sympathetic tone in the body, which results in a sudden major drop in blood pressure. And obviously, which is called neurogenic shock. And so it would have the same impact on the body as like very large blood loss. Like basically someone will just keel over, but it's neurogenic rather than caused by sort of hypovolemia or something like that. The last thing I want to talk about is a few of these autonomic reflexes. So these are just as automatic as the sort of spinal reflexes that are involved in like the knee jerk. So we can have coughing, sneezing, swallowing, vomiting. And they're not just organized in a similar way to the spinal knee jerk reflex. They're still actually, in many cases, motor reflexes, like coughing and sneezing in particular. So for example, for sneezing, we have irritation of the nasal mucosa, which activates sensory nerves, which lead to the sneezing center. It's a very scientific name. And that then sends projections to parasympathetic nuclei. And so that leads to increased secretions, and also projections to motor nuclei, which activate motor neurons that are then causing sort of specific movements in the pharyngeal, laryngeal, and respiratory muscles, actually generating a sneeze. The vomiting reflex is also a very classical, like direct reflex. And this is driven by other chemoreceptors. And it has, you don't need to remember what the receptors are, but it has a bunch of receptors. And it also receives, the vomiting center also receives information from the balance sensors within the ear. You remember those semicircular canals. And so this is why, we can get motion sickness. So, and then there's also another initiating pathway in the back of the mouth, which is the gag reflex, which will also activate this vomiting center. And then finally, there's inputs to the vomiting center from the gut, which is why, like different types of insults to the gut can also lead to vomiting. Did you have a quick question?
Is it sometimes like I can be in a car perfectly fine, but if I'm
reading and driving at the same time. The best explanation I have for the reading making you sick is that you're starting to get a discrepancy between what your eyes are seeing and what you're sort of sensing of motion. So you get a more exaggerated kind of motion from the book, as it's kind of which you're trying to follow with very fine detail. Whereas if you're sort of looking out the window, it's kind of, like the trees are kind of going past and they're sort of not like going up and down like that. And so it's the theory, at least behind why we have such a well-developed vomiting reflex, is that it's tied to anything that sort of gives us sensory distortions. is likely to be something bad that we ate. So, because there are so many poisons that cause problems with sensory perceptions and so on. And so when we start getting significant mismatches between our integrated sensory information, like so they're not all lined up properly, then our body basically suspects poisoning and goes safety first, let's throw up. Exactly. It's a good philosophy. So the outputs of this chemoreceptor trigger zone are going involve both motor function and both the peripheral and sympathetic branches of the nervous system. So we have increased salivation to protect the tooth enamel, which is parasympathetic. We have some activation of some of the enteric nervous system to cause reverse peristalsis of the in the small intestine. We have the lowering of the intrathoracic pressure, basically caused by closing the glottis and then breathing in, coupled with an increase in abdominal pressure as the abdominal muscles contract. And that is then propelling the stomach contents into the esophagus and out. And so we're generating these kind of pressure differentials through motor efferents. And then we also have this sympathetic response where, typically if we're throwing up, we're going to be sweating and so on, and have increased heart rate. And as we'll talk about at some point in the next couple of years in pharmacology, there are, it's not sort of, the pharmacology is not like, the detailed neuronal receptors aren't that well understood, but there are a bunch of different types of drugs that are effective at treating different aspects of sort of nausea and vomiting. So we're out of time, but I think we have managed to talk about like many of these different aspects. And again, I have some questions to help kind of guide your sort of study time from this class. And I think tomorrow is talking about high functions as well as a quiz. Yes.
So, for the purpose of study,
yes.
so as long as I can answer all these questions, I should be okay for the quiz of them, or should I look at other stuff that we might want?
So the vast majority of questions will be directly related to these study questions. There may be the occasional question that is only tenuously linked to them, just to sort of, because I don't want you to try and take this one page as being your study. So I do want you to sort of, but I basically want you to guide your studying of the slide sets through the eyes of these questions, if that makes sense. No, so that's the point of this. It's sort of like, but try and view the questions as sort of like not one word answers, right? Like, so I'm not suggesting that anyone would want to sort of write a like little paragraph or something for each thing, but it's like, think of it in that kind of way. So if you wanted to give an in-depth answer to each of those questions, you'd be good. Does that make sense?